Hello there, many thanks for joining us on our midweek business news report. It's now time to bring you the feature on the show today as we focus on the power sector. Now, there's a growing concern some banks will have to take over about 60% stake in the power distribution companies we have in the country from core investors for failing to repay at least 819.9 billion naira. Following the acquisition loans. The Central Bank of Nigeria in August 2021 put the acquisition loans to the power firms at 819.97 billion naira. Now, the DisCos were privatized in 2013 after the federal government, through the Bureau of Public Enterprises, received $1.25 billion as payment for 60% stake in 10 DisCos in 2013 and that of Kaduna DisCo in 2014 from investors. Now, while the power firms grapple with the acquisition loans, they have been unable to utilize the 213 billion naira Nigerian Electricity Market Stabilization Fund, a 10-year loan from the CBN in 2014 to stabilize the operations. That notwithstanding, now the power shortages still persist as customers are yet to get meters and electricity market shortfall continues to climb well over 1.7 trillion naira. Joining me now virtually to discuss this and much more, I have Chukwueluka Umer, the Chief Executive Officer of Century Power Generation. Thank you very much for joining us on the show today. And well, we can still say Happy New Year to you. Now, first and foremost, looking at this conversation, power generation companies presently have not improved beyond the 4,000 megawatts daily output we have here, and there's still a whole lot of high aggregate technical, commercial and collection losses across the DisCos. Average monthly energy remittance from DisCos to GenCos, which improved at the initial takeover stage, have consistently dropped on a monthly basis, well over 40%. Now, with all of these, how problematic would you say this reality is and the likely bank takeover, looking at the overall model these power firms are working with? Hello, Mr. Omer, can you hear me? So, Mr. Omer, my question here to you is, looking at the models these DisCos are working with, how problematic would you say the current reality is, looking at the bank takeover over this huge debt? DisCos largely have not necessarily improved beyond the 4,000 megawatts, and then we have a whole lot of issues, even with the basic power supply. What sort of reality do you see we'll have going forward, especially with this possible bank takeovers?
Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear, we can hear you.
Very well. Now, remember that I told you last year and the year before that this was going to happen. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, I told you this was going to happen, so this doesn't come as a surprise. Some of the companies that took over the DisCos are not prepared. Some of them got the DisCos unqualified, okay? And there are many problems that they're having to deal with. Liquidity problems in the market, poor regulations, interference, meddling from the government, and so on and so forth. So you're going to see the problem worsen. Some of these DisCos will have to be resold if we're ever going to see an improvement in the market. And again, the entire value chain needs to be reviewed. You know, all the way from gas generation to distribution, they have to be reviewed. If it doesn't happen, we're going to talk about this again next year.
And this sentiment you have right now is really the overall sentiment the average Nigerian also has, because we're having the same old conversation year in, year out, and nothing is done, really. But in terms of cost-reflective tariffs and helping to manage this debt, we also have to face the reality of erratic power supply. How do we now transcend towards the area of cost-reflective tariffs when we are not necessarily having power supply that would now make Nigerians see the need to pay much more for electricity?
Well, so now, yes, we've increased the tariff almost double, which is what was supposed to be done ab initio. But this was done much later than it was expected. Now, these discos have been over the years become more and more saddled with huge debts. They took loans to buy the assets, which of course we expected them to do. Nobody has so much money just sitting down doing nothing. But the interest on these loans continue to increase. And because it took so long to increase the tariff, to a more market reflective tariff, the debt burden on these assets have become so huge that they don't necessarily have enough liquidity to make the improvements in their DisCo that is expected. Also, remember, the government still owns 40% of each DisCo. So they're not running a truly private enterprise. And as we've seen in Nigeria, the government really has no business in business. You should allow the DisCos to do business on their own. So if we're going to see an improvement, we need to start seeing creation of utilities. And now when I say utility, you should have, for example, in a Lagos state, Gencos should be able to produce electricity and sell directly to either a co-DisCo or a Ikeja DisCo. Okay? The Gencos should be able to talk directly to the gas producer, and whatever price they get the gas at needs to be passed down the chain. The transmission line, on the other hand, held by TCN, should be unbundled so that those people that are able to make the required investment to improve the transmission infrastructure can make it. Now think about this. 8 years later, we're still talking about having a theoretical willing capacity on our transmission lines of about 8,000 megawatts. But in reality, we've never really transmitted over 5,000 or 5,300 megawatts on our transmission lines. So again, we're going to have this conversation 5 years from today. Same conversation, unless we start to make these changes.
Now, Mr. Omer, the reality on ground we also have is the fact that we are seeing a much worse situation. As we speak today, estates that had previously about 16 hours of power supply per day now are barely having 10 hours. It's difficult for the average Nigerian to have to pay much more for electricity and then still have to look for alternative sources. But looking at off-grid and on-grid solutions, which you made mention of, it's already more than 8 years down the line since the privatization of the power sector. What sort of reform do you think can have any sort of shape, especially as this marks the last active year of the Buhari administration and also preparing a new phase for any incoming government?
Well, when you have a sector like the power sector being treated as if it's a social responsibility, when you're treating a commodity like electricity as if it's something that the government needs to provide as a social item to the government, to the populace, this is what you're going to see. Electricity needs to be treated just the same way we treat the telecoms industry. Okay? The telecoms industry is driven and run primarily by private companies. Okay? All the things they need in their own value chain are provided by the private sector. And regulation is created to allow investment. Now, the regulations on the telecoms industry got progressively tighter, which is the right thing to do. But in the power sector, we have tried to go with the regulation first and then hope that the market will develop. You do not put the cart before the horse. The horse must be in front of the cart if you're going to make any progress. For us to see progress, what we need to have is the regulations need to be relaxed. The government needs to understand power is something that is a commodity and should be sold like a commodity. People that need it should be able to buy it. And if you can't buy it, you don't use it. If the government wants to help, then it can subsidize. Okay? So the regulations need to be fixed. Rule of law needs to be put in place. The market needs to be treated and handled by the private sector. And, by the way, we need better security so that the infrastructure that is being installed by these private companies will be protected, and the people doing the installation can be protected. These are a few things that we need the government to do. But now what we're seeing is states are getting more involved. And if you look at Akwa Ibom, for example, they have an Ibom power that has a capacity of about 190 megawatts. But they are not able to dispatch more than 100 megawatts because of transmission infrastructure failures. Now, the government is stepping in to help install transmission infrastructure to be able to dispatch the power. I'm not suggesting that the government of different states should do the same thing. However, the government of different states should be able to create an enabling environment to allow investors like ourselves come and put in the required infrastructure. And we need to be able to talk to each other.
Well, we need to have a very clear blueprint, especially in regards to power sector and how we also handle the affairs we have going on. We deserve better as Nigerians. We have a whole lot of resources that we can utilize, and it's time to think outside the box. Thank you very much for your time on the breakfast show this morning, Chukwueluka Ume. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and we hope government is listening.
My pleasure, David. Thank you. Have a nice day.